Big Tusk by Brendan Connolly. Read for you by Paul Carlow. One day the tribe was out hunting mammoths. They had torches made out of fire, and their pack dogs chased the mammoths off a cliff, not seeing the baby mammoth, leaving it behind. The baby mammoth was hidden in the bushes. A day later, the baby mammoth was calling for its mother. The children of the local tribe were playing on the ice. The children heard its crying for its mother. The children brought it to the village and showed it to the adults. The adults wanted to kill it, but the children asked the chief of the village could they raise it. He said, "As long as it doesn't grow up, go out of control, and kill you." The chief of the village asked the tribe to go out and catch a cow and a calf and bring it back to the village. The rest of the people dug a pit. They kept the other baby mammoth in a makeshift pen. The tribe found a herd of mammoths. They sent word back to the chief of the village. The chief gave word back to the men who found the herd of mammoths that he would send word back when the pit was finished. Then he went to check on the progress of the pit and how the men were getting on digging it. When he checked how the baby mammoth was getting on, he told the children to give the baby mammoth some water and try feeding it grass. Then he went to where the men were digging the pit. When he got there, the men were just about finished digging the pit. He told them to cover it over with sticks and leaves so the mammoth would not see the pit. Then he sent word back to the men who were keeping an eye on the herd to separate a mother mammoth and a baby from the main herd. They did this by using torches made of fire and their pack dogs. The man that gave them the messages that the pit was ready guided them back to where the pit was. When they got the mother mammoth and her baby back to the pit, and when they got to the pit, they separated the mother from her baby. Then they guided the mother over towards the pit. She fell in with a mighty thud, but they lined the bottom of the pit with grass and leaves so that she would not hurt herself. She was calling for her baby when she got on her feet. They let the baby go close to the edge of the pit, but they put a rope around its neck so that it wouldn't fall into the pit. When the other mammoth saw the baby mammoth, she calmed down a wee bit. The chief was there, telling the tribe what to do. He told them to get rope for the other baby mammoth. The men got to the village and they went to the pen where the baby mammoth was in. They took it out of the pen and they got rope out of one of the wigwams, and they went back to the pit. They lassoed the mother mammoth and tied ropes around her legs so she wouldn't hurt the new baby mammoth when she was feeding. Everything went well, and after a few weeks, she let the new baby mammoth feed from her. They let the babies take turns by lowering them down into the pit. The chief was thinking they should make the pit bigger, so he thought of an idea to line the pit with logs and to dig around the logs on the outside of the pit to make the pit bigger and keep the mother mammoth in the pit. The men brought back the logs and lined the pit. They then started digging to make the pit bigger. It took them a week, but they finally got the new pit finished. They dug it in the shape of a circle. It was much bigger now. The chief told the men to tie up the mother. Then they took logs away and let her loose, and they ran for their lives. She was looking around at her new surroundings, but she seemed a wee bit happier. she could see the baby mammoths. The pit was much bigger than what she was kept in before, so the chief told the men to lower down the baby mammoths into the pit with the mother mammoth. They fed the mother mammoth well with grass, so she would get ready for the winter. They got some long logs, and they covered over half of the pit, so she and the baby mammoths would have some shelter from the snow in the winter. Something they never did before was cut grass and let it dry, and they made a big frame and they lined it with skins. When the grass was dry, they put it into the tent. Soon it started to snow and freeze over. The summer was over. During the winter, the adult mammoth became so tame that she let the men go in and feed her. The chief decided in the spring that the chief would let her out of the pit and see if she would stay with him. The ice and snow started to melt. Spring was coming. One morning, when all the snow was nearly melted, they decided to make a ramp to let the mother and the baby mammoths out. They took one of the babies and guided it towards the ramp. The mother followed. When they got up, the chief was wondering, were they going to walk away or stay? So he ordered the tribe and the children to walk back to the village to see what would happen. He looked behind and he could see the mammoth and the babies were following them back to the village, and he smiled. He thought it was a good sign that her and the babies might stay with them. Weeks passed, and the mammoth and babies grazed outside the village and stayed nearby. The children were playing one day beside the mammoth and her babies. The people of the village were nearby. Suddenly, there was a small earthquake, and the ground moved, just for a second, moving a big round rock. It was heading straight for the children. The mother mammoth saw it. She ran directly towards the rock, going between the children and the rock, stopping it with her big tusk. The people of the village saw the mammoth save the children. They went back to the village and told the chief that she stopped the big rock with her big tusk. Seeing that she saved the children's lives, he decided to give her a name and called her Big Tusk, because she used her big tusk to save the children. It left the chief thinking. He heard how strong she was from the men in the village who witnessed her saving the children. He went to the wise man of the village and told him what he was thinking, that maybe they could use Big Tusk to pull things for them. The wise man told him to come back in 2 days. The wise man that night went sitting at the fire, looking up at the stars. During the night he fell asleep, sitting at the fire, and during the night he had a dream. He woke up the next morning and asked the children to get some dried grass and some hair from the baby mammoth. When the children brought it back to him, he went into his tent with the hair, the grass, some food, some water, and he did not come out until the next day, when he had to go to the chief. 2 days had passed, and the chief had come back to the wise man. The wise man showed him a model of a mammoth. The model had a harness made of baby mammoth hair. The chief was looking at it, and he thought the idea was good, and he ordered the wise man and some men from the village to go ahead and make a harness for Big Tusk. So the wise man told the men to get him some skins, and he started cutting out some long straight strips of leather and sewed it together with some mammoth hair to make a harness for Big Tusk. The wise man knew he had to make it comfortable for Big Tusk by making the harness adjustable. So a few days had passed, and the harness was finished. They went to the meadows where Big Tusk and the babies were grazing, bringing food for them and for Big Tusk. At first, she did not want to put it on, but the men kept at it. She struggled, knocking one of the men to the ground. But seeing what she had done, she picked him up with her trunk, settled down, and let them put the harness on. Then the wise man and the chief told the men to leave the harness on for a week so that she could get used to it. A week had passed. The chief, the wise man, and the men went back to Big Tusk. The chief ordered the men to get a small log to see if she would pull it. They got the log. Then the chief told them to get a rope. They attached the rope and the log to the harness. He ordered the men to get some grass and some branches with leaves on it to entice Big Tusk to walk. Nothing happened at first, but eventually Big Tusk started to walk with the log. She did not like it at first, but then she got used to it. Days passed, and they started attaching heavier loads onto the harness. Then they started using her doing work. Autumn ended, and winter was coming along. They started to get ready for winter, cutting grass for Big Tusk. They needed more grass this winter because the babies were now eating grass. Winter came and the men went out hunting. A couple of weeks passed, and they came back and went to the chief, telling him about a big river to the south. It was frozen over now, but the men said it would be a good place for a new village. So the chief decided, just before the snows ended, that he would make a sled for Big Tusk to pull, and they would move closer to the river. When the sled was finished and it was coming near to the end of winter, they loaded the sled with food for Big Tusk and the babies, and they started to take some of their wigwams down. It took them a couple of weeks, and eventually they got to the new site of the village, using some of the dogs to pull small sleds to pull some of their tent tools. Spring had come, and the snow and ice had started to melt. They were happy at their new village, Big Tusk, the babies, and the dogs. The chief one day was down at the river, and he saw a falling tree float by, giving him an idea. He went back to the village and told the children to get him a long piece of wood about the thickness of his arm. He got one of his stone tools that he used to cut the leather with, and he started to hollow the wee small log that he got. What he had made was a model of a canoe. So he got some men and he showed them his model, and they went to the big forest about 2 miles from the village. When they got to the wood, the chief picked a tall tree. They went back to get some tools and Big Tusk, and a wigwam to sleep in, and some food and water. The chief left them to it, and they started to chop away at the tree. A couple of days had passed, and the tree was about to fall. The men heard it starting to creak and crack. The men got to a safe distance, away from the tree. It eventually fell over, with a mighty thud. Then they started to take the branches off the tree, so they would be left with just the trunk. They got Big Tusk to clear away branches from the main tree. This had taken them a week to do, but Big Tusk had made it easy for them, pulling away the heavier branches. Then they had started to hollow out the tree to make the canoe. The chief came down to see how their progress was getting on. He even did a bit of work. 2 weeks had passed, and now they were just about done hollowing out the canoe. The hard bit was to get the canoe to the river, but they used Big Tusk's mighty strength to pull it. The chief went to the wise man to think of an easier way for Big Tusk to pull the canoe to the river. The wise man said, "Come back to him in 2 days, and he will have his answer." That night, the wise man sat at the fire and looked up at the stars, and he fell asleep, and he had a dream. Next day he got up and he asked the children to get him some dried grass and hair from the baby mammoth, and some branches from a tree. Then he got to work making a model of Big Tusk and a canoe. He cut out small pieces of wood that would go under the canoe to act as wheels, to make it easier for Big Tusk to pull it. As Big Tusk was pulling the canoe, there would be 2 men at the back, pulling out the log and putting it at the front. 6 or 7 logs were under the canoe to act as a pulley system. The chief went back to the wise man, and the wise man showed him his idea. The chief thought it was a brilliant idea. He went back to where the canoe was and the men of the village. He showed the model to the men, and they got to work making it. When they were finished, they got Big Tusk to pull the canoe down to the river. It took them a day, but they got it there. The chief told the men to put the canoe into the river. They had a rope tied to the canoe so that it wouldn't float away. 2 men got into the canoe, but they had no way of steering it. The wise man had come down to the river to see the canoe, and he saw that they could not steer it in the water. He had an idea to make oars out of long, skinny sticks. They stood up in the canoe and stuck the sticks in the water to move it along. After a while, the men thought of a way to make smaller oars. They used a canoe for fishing and getting across the river. Weeks went past, and the men were out hunting one day, and they saw a fire heading for the village. They ran back as fast as they could. The fire was miles away, and they had time to move the village and wigwams. They got Big Tusk to pull a sled down to the river, with the wigwams on it. It was harder to do because there was no snow or ice. Then they used the canoe to bring a rope across to the other side of the river. They tied the rope to a tree so the women and men could use the rope as a safety line, and they took the children over in the canoe. They got across, but the fire was getting closer to the river. They had to leave Big Tusk and the baby mammoths behind. The river was too deep for Big Tusk and the baby mammoths to cross. She would probably drown with all the hair she had on her. Big Tusk and the babies were calling out for help as the fire got closer. The chief looked across the river at Big Tusk and the babies, and he thought he could not leave them behind. After all, Big Tusk had done for them. He and a few men went back to the side of the river where the fire was, and they began to walk Big Tusk downriver away from the fire. They walked for miles and miles. It took them 2 days, but they found a shallow part of the river where Big Tusk and the babies could cross. After a few days, they got back to the people of the village. Rain had come and put out the fire. The chief and the people set up a new village on the other side of the river, at the spot where Big Tusk and the babies crossed. A couple of weeks passed and everything was going nicely. Big Tusk was grazing near the village, but when Big Tusk was calling to her babies, she was heard from the distance by saber-toothed tigers, heading to the village and to Big Tusk and the babies. Big Tusk was grazing and the saber-tooths came down from the hills. Children were playing near Big Tusk and the babies. Dogs smelled the saber-toothed tigers coming, and they started to bark. The saber-toothed tigers surrounded the children, Big Tusk and the babies. One of the children got back to the village and told the adults. The men and the chief got their spears and their dogs. They were holding off the saber-toothed tigers, but there was 4 or 5 of them. All of a sudden, Big Tusk and the babies started to trumpet out for more help. All of a sudden, a big herd of mammoths came running out of the valley to where Big Tusk, the babies, the saber-toothed tigers and the men were. The mammoths, the people of the village and the dogs fought off the saber-toothed tigers. The saber-toothed tigers cowered away. Big Tusk and the other mammoths So ahead, the people and the dogs fought off the saber-toothed tigers for them, and they stayed with the people of the village, becoming their friends, and the people came to be known as the People of the Mammoth. Written by Brendan Connolly, August 20th, 2012. Copyright Brendan Connolly.